So Stephen Abdullah Maynard is a psychotherapist who has practiced predominantly in communities of people of colour since the 90s. He developed the certificate in counselling in the context of racism, the first transcultural counselling course in the UK, and has pioneered in the field of Islamic counselling. Welcome, Abdullah. You will be speaking on unconscious bias, and we're ready for you when you are.
Thank you very much, Mariam. And I also just wanted to start by thanking Gail. That was so open, honest, heartfelt, and because of that, so tough to follow. But thank you, thank you. I'd actually like to start by giving people about a minute just to jot down, perhaps on a piece of paper if you've got it, any experiences they've had of observing unconscious bias. It might be something that would be useful to reflect on as this talk goes on, and hopefully we'll come back to it later on. But I just wanted you to kind of like engage with that if possible. So I'll just give you a little bit of time for that. Okay. Before we go any further, I just wanted to say something I just wanted to say this quickly. Mary had a little lamb, but I preferred the baked lobster. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, now, unconscious bias, if we could move on. I'm assuming that a number of people would have heard what I said and thought, that's a bit odd. And that's because of the way that we actually do so much of our thinking without actually thinking. There's so many things which are automated, unconscious, pre-conscious. There's so much that's kind of like default that enables us to get on with living. And that's been the way, literally, for the last 70 to 100,000 years since we became conscious social animals. We've been able to think at this very, very sophisticated level in which we don't need to take up too much active thinking power to do all the basic stuff. And that enables us to be the creatures that we are. Able to build reality through our understandings of meanings and our explanations of things, the narratives, the stories that we actually tell. So that's important because there's a social psychologist by the name of Tujvel who came to a conclusion a while ago that actually the thing that keeps groups of people together isn't so much what they share, it's more about what is different between this group and the other group. So actually we seem to come together more through the distancing rather than the shared focus. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So in that context, let's actually think a little bit about unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is learned. It's important to think about that because it is part of our response to our experience. It's not necessarily a part that we're always aware of because, as I'm saying, it's a stuff that we accumulate and it kind of feeds into our conscious thinking by doing all of the easy stuff, the stuff that would take up too much work and effort. Without unconscious bias, we would have to spend so much time understanding the patterns of things, the parameters of things. Unconscious bias is how we actually are able to attribute certain aspects of meaning. And that means that having unconscious bias, we actually don't have to do so much mental work. There is a problem with this, though, and that problem is that unconscious bias is also a collection, therefore, of learned stereotypes that are critically important in terms of the way that we interact socially. These stereotypes are unintentional, they're ingrained, they facilitate our beliefs, and in doing that, they actually enable us to interact and behave in certain ways. There is evidence that effectively we would not be able to decipher all of the meanings, all of the memes, if we were actually having to try and stop, analyze, think through every situation we interact with every single person in the minutiae of it. Is this a nice person? Okay. Is this a good person? Okay. Is what they're doing right now good? If we had to take that time on every interaction, we would not get through life, or so it would seem. Let's move on to the next slide. Now, there are some mechanisms for unconscious bias, the ways that it works. So one of the most basics is this thing, affinity bias, the tendency to warm up to people who are like us. Quite often I do exercise in training, and this thing about warming to people, it's quite funny. I do this exercise in which I get people to think about how they would as a 3-year-old greet their favorite aunt or uncle, and then how they would as a 3-year-old greet an aunt or uncle that they really despised. The way that we are in our interactions, whether or not we are warm, whether or not we feel as though we are with kindred spirit, it's weird, because if they're like us and we like them, then we give them so much more. And that links into this next thing, the halo effect, the tendency to think that everything about a person is good simply because we like them. So, wow, you know, favorite aunt, the generous aunt, the nice aunt, the good aunt, the right aunt, least favored uncle, the nasty uncle, the bad uncle. It's a bit like, there used to be a thing in the Middle Ages. Kings could have this kind of rule of good to the people I like and bad to the people I don't like. There's also this thing, perception bias, a tendency to believe one thing about a group of people and then base stereotypes and assumptions, making it very, very, very difficult to think about an individual within that group in an objective way. Because if they are all like so, then how can this one be like so? No, this is how they are. And that clearly relates to the stuff which we sometimes call confirmation bias, the tendency to confirm pre-existing ideas and assumptions about a group of people. Well, this individual did that thing, so clearly they're all going to be like that. It's weird because we talk so much about how amazing we are as humanity, how diverse and incredible we are as the human family, yet we have this inbuilt way of trying not to see that beauty, trying not to see that range. And that's not just about how we are in relation to others. It also impacts on how we are in relation to ourselves. So this thing of groupthink, the tendency to try really hard to fit into an existing culture. If we are supposed to be like this, then I must be like this. And I will do the things I need to do to hone my identity to be part of this, because of the importance of that belonging, the importance of that thing of we. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, now, the issue is not about the existence of unconscious bias. I want to try and suggest to you that unconscious bias is something that's hardwired into the brain. It kind of like does all the default processing to help us just get on with the good stuff, theoretically. So that enables us to build our social relationships to a far greater degree. The problem isn't about unconscious bias. The problem is more about how unconscious bias then fits or doesn't fit with our conscious thinking. So let's take a bogus concept like race, as it's been used for a few hundred years. The idea that there are different races of people. We know so clearly, and actually I say now, but we've known from the very beginning there is only one species, only one race, human beings, that's it. Yet, if we actually understand the kind of things that I was talking about in relation to the nature of unconscious bias, and actually think about the role that unconscious bias has played in the structuring of the world hierarchically in relation to race. It's useful to think about, to consider the relationship between a few things that I've got down on this slide in terms of their timings. So between 1545 and 1687, we talk about the birth of modern science. So theoretically, irrespective of everything that had happened in various places around the world beforehand, within Europe, we get to this place where suddenly we know how to be rational and objective in relation to fact. And this then links to the stuff that happens between 1685 and 1815, the Enlightenment, this period in which people become people of reason. So you've got facts, you've got reason, yet they're sitting in relation to the reality of slavery. So how do we then understand the way that these things come together, if not through the ways that we interact with our unconscious bias? I suppose what I'm trying to suggest to you is this, that for the double speak of racism even to exist, there's a significant role in the relationship between the processes that went on and the fact that we chose not to think about them. Fine, yeah, it's true. There are ways in which we find it easier to be with people like ourselves. But that's an unconscious level of our thinking, and there is a conscious level of thinking which can then ask the question which is actually, is it really difficult to be with people who are unlike me? However, we know the reality, and unconscious bias in the context of the factors that I've just mentioned has had a very, very real impact in shaping the modern world. Let's move on. So, let's consider this. A couple in a car struggle to protect themselves and their child from assailants. Or you could say, two black people resist arrest. And I'm referring to the situation that happened with Bianca Williams and her husband earlier on this week. This is something that's taken place within the UK for people who are visiting or participating in this from other locations. It can be found on various news streams because there is some pretty harrowing video footage. But if you actually look at those two interpretations of reality, those two different narratives, you could argue that they both relate to the facts, but it's about how you actually see this, how you actually allow yourself to perceive the reality, what questions you ask, how much you take for granted, and from where you start, that will have a big impact on which of these two narratives will seem to be the correct explanation of what took place. Let's move on. Unchallenged, unconscious bias is, certainly in relation to race, an aspect of pretty much every aspect of reality as perceived or experienced by people of color, because of the structural realities of oppression which have sat on top of the unconscious bias of those who are in positions of power. But if we think not about the structural stuff, if we think about what this means at a personal level, that's when we get to this really interesting stuff about the evidence of the fact that doctors will give less pain medication to black patients than white patients, irrespective of the fact that actually, if you were to stop and carefully think through the injuries and what the appropriate response is, the same response would be the same responses as in terms of pain medication that's given to a white person would necessarily be appropriate to a black person. If we think about all of the stuff around people trying to, people interacting across race, the fact that so many white people have been shown through research to find expressions of black faces more threatening than the same expression when it's actually on the face of a white person. All of the evidence that's stacked up around stuff like how people who are applying for jobs, if they are white, are more successful than if they are of color. It's unconscious bias in relation to structured prejudices such as race. It greases every wheel. It enables racism, it enables colorism, it facilitates the invisibility of black people. It interacts not only with the conscious thought of white people, it interacts with the conscious thought of black people, because clearly, if there is a set of memes which sits within a society, and these are dominant and these are feeding into the thinking at a level that we're not going to interrogate, then yeah, it will impact on the thinking of all. So it will facilitate stuff like how black and white people engage with the reality of their own situation and the reality of each other's situation. Let's move on. So, for example, there's a thing that was shown to me by my partner. It comes from a website, Galden, and it's about some research. Where are the Black girls in our CSA services? The idea of the strong Black woman defines the way that Black women are treated within mental health services and often leads to the adultification of adolescent Black girls. So there was this piece of work that basically explored the ways that Black girls are neglected in relation to child abuse services, and how their experiences are racialized in relation to sexual abuse and violence. Black girls are perceived as less in need of protection and support and nurture. But if you stop and think, this is a child of this age in this situation, but the problem is, this is what happens with the unconscious thinking. The unconscious bias is actually, no, within this particular group, there is somehow a different categorization. Let's take this further forward. Let's go to the next slide. So, when racism operates at a level where it interacts with the unconscious thought, it isn't necessarily obvious what will come out. So you get issues around the intersectionality of race and gender. So you get stuff around the sexualization of the objectified other, of the Black person. There was an article that you can see the first paragraph of it from The Eye, which is a leading paper here in the UK. And as you can see, the headline is "The Dishi Rishi outpouring is about one thing, unconscious bias." And it's funny because here we have a situation in which the Chancellor of the Exchequer, one of the most important politicians in British government, sits at his desk in a hoodie, and the response on Twitter is all about about how attractive he is. He's reduced from a person of significance to an object of desire. And that's interesting because this has been going on forever. This has been going on forever and a day. You'll note there's a photograph of Linford Christie next to the article on Rishi Sunak. Linford Christie was a British athlete who was exemplary. He won the 100 meters and he had the Olympic gold medal, the Commonwealth gold medal, the world gold, everything. No sooner does he succeed in doing this than actually the article that's run in the Sun newspaper talks about his lunchbox. And it's referring effectively to his genitalia as it can be seen through his pants. And it's weird how this relates because you've got this taking place in the 80s and you've got this outstanding athlete reduced to a sexual object to such an extent that actually he then participates. Because remember what I was saying a moment ago in terms of the way in which this process also relates to internalized oppression. So yeah, that's why you've got this photograph of him advertising Sloggies. but it also relates to this thing about which Fanon wrote some 30 years earlier. So yeah, this is no longer a man, this is no longer a black person, this is now a penis. This is all that he is reduced to. But beyond that, if we move on to the next slide, is the invisibility that can occur through unconscious bias. I am fairly certain that most people in this room will, in this webinar, I should say, will be aware of Madeleine McCann. I wonder how many people will be aware of Elizabeth. Let's move on. So we have a problem. We have a problem in that unconscious bias negatively impacts, but it's not just as simple as thinking that it negatively impacts the minority, which is dehumanized through the process. Unconscious bias negatively impacts both those who are in positions of power, who actually feed from their unconscious bias, their conscious thinking, their it can be called, it can be, no, I won't say it can be called, their limited thinking in a way which actually then is not able to see the humanity of the people that are reduced through these memes, through these lazy ways of conception. Unconscious bias impacts not just on the minority, it actually reduces the resilience, reduces the scope for development of all. And that's because what happens is that there is a way in which the objective reality, the objective facts, the truth of the world don't chime with the convenient answers that come from lazy thinking that is based on unconscious bias. It's weird. There's a piece on YouTube. Akala, he gave a lecture at the Oxford Union, and it's actually about African history, and he was talking about the Egyptians, and he was basically talking about the fact that if you look at it, there has been evidence from before the Egyptologists went there, all the way back to the material that actually the Egyptians created about themselves through their understanding from the perspective of the ancient Greeks, etc., 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 which basically shows that Egyptians were of African origin. They were not some kind of light-skinned, once white people. But if there's going to be a way in which there has to be an entitlement perception which requires an understanding of black people as lesser than white people. And if that entitlement perception is going to enable people to feel secure in themselves, then there has to be a false trail of fact. And that false trail of fact, that mythology, when it's challenged, it's not just about the myths going, it's actually about the perceptions of those who believed in them going, and therefore the identities going. And that is a fragility, and that comes from not looking at reality. So, yeah, sure, unconscious bias It impacts directly on opportunity and the experience of people who are marginalized, people who are other. But it also impacts indirectly the people who are marginalizing because of it. Let's move on to the next slide. What this basically means then is that unconscious bias has a negative impact directly on human development. If we think about the fact that our brains are hardwired for sugar and fat, we can understand how it is that in a world in which those things are rare, we can actually live healthily, but in a world in which those things are ubiquitous, where we have access to them, there's a strong temptation to indulge, to gorge, and that will actually make us weak. That will actually have a direct impact on who we are, who we become, how we develop. And this thing about living through fragile myths is in a way very similar to this issue around sugar and fat. Human beings of all species of, what am I saying? Human beings of all colors, of all creeds, are phenomenal, wonderful, incredible, and others from which we can learn, benefit, grow, etc. And that is where humanity lies, that exchange, that ability to interact with another truth, another reality, which then makes us greater. But if we, because the need for hierarchical ranking, reduce the other to something less than us, then we actually destroy our own capacity to grow. We imprison ourselves as well as we imprison others. And I'm saying that not just because, or I'm saying that really to try and suggest that unconscious bias, though this talk has been primarily about race, unconscious bias is something that can fit across a number of paradigms of oppression. So yeah, what we've been saying, what I've been saying today makes sense in relation to race, but we can see how it makes sense in relation to sexism or many of the other prejudices as well. And that is pretty much all I wanted to say. I hope that has been of use. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen Abdullah Maynard, for a wonderful and enlightening talk on unconscious bias.